America has exceptional military, economic, and diplomatic power. Use it. Russia is right now essentially laughing at you. They think that you're a rube. They think they're playing you along, tapping you along, as Trump likes to say. They've never been negotiating with you in good faith. And to Trump specifically, if you do end this war in a way that is advantageous to the Ukrainian people, that the Ukrainian people feel is a good deal for them, they will be the first calling for you to get a Nobel Peace Prize. So if you really want that, end the war in a way that benefits Ukraine.
Hi, I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to the Trump Report on Times Radio. A reminder, you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on our YouTube channel, and you can also listen and follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today, I'm delighted to say, is Jimmy Rushton, Kyiv-based foreign policy and security analyst, speaking to us from Kyiv. Jimmy, how are you doing? I hope you're keeping safe.
Yeah, not too bad. Kyiv is relatively noisy on a relatively frequent basis at the moment, but yeah, we're doing okay here.
I'm glad to hear it. Now, today on the show, we're going to be discussing Donald Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin, and whether this was the week that Trump finally ran out of patience with the Russian president. He said earlier this week, after the two spoke on the phone, that they had made little progress to ending the war, and we get a lot of BS thrown at us by Putin. If you want to know the truth, he's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless. What was your sort of initial reaction watching that play out earlier this week?
I mean, it's tentative steps in the right direction. It's good that he finally seems to understand that Putin is saying one thing to him, and then his actions demonstrate that he's carrying out another thing, via his military actions in Ukraine. I think, as ever with Trump, it's not really what he says, it's what he does. And we have heard that there is a possibility that there's going to be a new authorization of military aid to Ukraine using presidential drawdown authority. Reuters were reporting that it's going to be in the region of 300 million and that it's going to be announced on Monday. There's also potentially going to be a big Trump speech on Russia on Monday as well. So, we'll wait and see what happens. But it does seem to be tentative baby steps in the right direction.
Yeah, does that show that this sort of has moved the dial? As you say, in the past, whenever we've heard sort of Trump talk tough, perhaps his words haven't been backed up by action, but it does seem that he is going to send his first weapons package to Ukraine since his second term began, and some reports say it's up to sort of $300 million worth.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what Reuters are reporting. I hope so. I think Trump, he was incredibly naive going into these negotiations with Putin. He genuinely seemed to believe that he was his friend and that he had a relationship with him, whereas Putin, experienced intelligence officer, was in the KGB for 16 odd years in East Germany, and he was developing his relationship with Trump as an intelligence officer, developing an asset, essentially. He was playing him, leading him along. I think Trump used the term tapping him along. And yeah, that's exactly what he was doing. But Putin is only really interested in stalling Trump for time. He still believes that he can win militarily. And once, if he continues to believe that he can win militarily in Ukraine, he's not going to come to the peace negotiations, at least not in any sincerity, with any kind of willingness to actually end this war.
You talk about Putin's history and all his experience. Do you think the Kremlin will be at all concerned by this tonal shift from Donald Trump?
I mean, I definitely think they'll be concerned if America starts sending more weapons to Ukraine, of course, because the Americans are the biggest military donor to Ukraine by far. They provide weaponry that really can't be supplied by anyone else, specifically these PAC-3 anti-ballistic missile interceptors, which are fired from the Patriot systems, also GMLRS, which are the precision-guided rockets fired from HIMARS and M270. So, Europe can still support Ukraine, but they can't supply them with these systems, especially, even if they have them, like Germany has Patriots, but they would have to have American permission to supply them as well. So I think for the Russians, they definitely were hoping Trump would just stop weapon supplies to Ukraine, full stop. That hasn't happened. And the pause in weapon supplies, it does seem like it was people in the Pentagon, Elbridge Colbury, and Pete Hegseth, essentially freelancing, and it was done without Trump's consent or permission or even knowledge.
You've recently spent some time on the ground with Ukrainian troops. Has that lack of aid and support been felt by them, and how welcome will the news of more support be?
So yeah, I was with 3rd Assault Brigade in the east for about a week and a half. To be honest, the stoppage wasn't felt, not least because when you do have one of these supply shipments that's held up, it takes a little bit of time for it to the effects to be felt on the front line. I think where it was felt was in Kyiv, because one of the things that was held up in Poland was these PAC-3 anti-ballistic missile interceptors, and Kyiv was hit by ballistic missiles during that period. So I think that's probably one of the things that might have been felt directly by the Ukrainians. And interestingly enough, about an hour and a half ago, a massive Ukrainian AN-124 cargo plane was flying over Kyiv. First time for many, many years, in fact, that we've seen an aircraft like this flying into Kyiv, and I think it's very possible that this is critical military supplies that had been held up, and is now being delivered to the Ukrainians.
And is that a sort of a total game changer for Ukrainian troops?
I mean, it's not a game changer. I think it just enables the status quo to continue. It enables Kyiv to be relatively well protected, at least against ballistic missiles. That is just obviously one threat. The drone threat is still significant. Every night they're sending hundreds of these Russian-Iranian Shahed drones, which are essentially small propeller-powered cruise missiles at Ukraine, and they're too numerous and too cheap to be shot down and effectively countered by surface-to-air missiles, because there's just too many of them. And Ukraine are working on interceptor drones in order to combat them, but that program is still a way off maturity. So that's going to be a problem, and it's going to be a problem that only increases for Ukraine as Russia increases production.
The Ukrainian people have much more important things to worry about than Donald Trump, but I just wanted to ask what the general feeling is towards him at the moment, and whether there is a sense in Ukraine that sort of US opinion is shifting.
I mean, coming up to his inauguration, Ukrainians were probably more optimistic about him than many other Europeans, simply because he kept talking about seeking peace through strength. And for Ukrainians, that sounds pretty good, right? But when he actually got into office, he seemed to abandon that line. Hopefully, we've gotten back to the Trump that was talking about peace through strength, because America is fantastically powerful economically, diplomatically, and militarily, and they can force Russia to come to the peace table. They absolutely can if they choose to. I think hopefully the naivety in the Trump administration has worn off. I think they were also naive in the feeling that they could do business with the Russians and that Russia would somehow be some form of commercial partner. And the reality is it's a large country, but it's relatively poor, and there's not going to be that much business to be done with Russia. Hopefully they understand that now as well.
You say there's not much business to be done with Russia. Yeah, you mentioned it earlier that Trump has teased there's going to be some major news on Russia on Monday. Do you think this is finally going to be that long-awaited harsh sanctions package?
Potentially, I think it's possibly going to be the announcement of this new weapons package for Ukraine. I hope that they've just realised that there's going to be no peace as long as Putin does not feel the pressure, because until he feels that it's in Russia's and his personal interest to come to the negotiating table, he's not going to do it, right? He has appealing to him as Trump has attempted to do. He's talked about the numbers of soldiers dying on both sides. Putin doesn't care about that. In fact, if you look at the Russian kind of national mythos surrounding the Great Patriotic War, they essentially, mythologize sacrifice and the amount of people that died in that war. Mostly avoidably, by the way. That people talk about the millions of Russians that died to defeat the Nazis in the Second World War. but a lot of those casualties were completely preventable and only occurred because of massive failures in the Soviet leadership. But the wider point is that Russians are prepared essentially to suffer significant casualties in order to achieve what they believe to be their military objectives. So for Putin, he needs to believe that it's in his and Russia's interest to negotiate rather than to keep expending Russian lives to gain a few more meters of territory in Ukraine.
Do you agree? Do you go further than that and agree with Ukraine's former defense minister, Alexei Reznikov, who gave an interview to The Times, I think, this morning, and he said, there's no end to the war while Putin is there. Essentially, while Putin is in power, the war is never going to end.
I think I would question what he means by war. I think whilst Putin is in power, Russia is always going to be hostile. I think it's very possible that we might see an end to the kind of more active, more kinetic phase of hostilities on the ground, but we might move into a kind of a shadow war similar to what we had in the Cold War, where you had heavy espionage, deniable actions. We've seen widespread use of these Telegram recruited assassins and saboteurs. There was a case in the UK very recently where a number of Brits were convicted of burning down a property belonging to a pro-Ukrainian business that was storing aid for Ukraine. And they did this. They were recruited on Telegram by the Wagner Group. And this is the sort of thing the Russians do. They pay money to people that they recruit on Telegram, and they get them to do minor acts of sabotage and sometimes actually quite major acts of sabotage. In Ukraine, we've seen them pay assassins. We've seen them use people as unwitting suicide bombers. People pick up a package, they're paid to deliver it to a location by a Russian agent on Telegram. But once they get to that location, the package explodes and kills the unwitting suicide bomber and destroys the target or attempts to destroy the target. So, I think it's very possible we'll see the war continue in that respect. I do think it's possible that we might see, the actual hot phase of the war end. But who knows? I mean, he might be right. He might be right. He might have a better read of the situation than I do in this respect.
With everything you've just said there, if you go back to the issue of sanctions, I mean, is there actually any level of sanctions that would make the Kremlin sort of sit up and take notice? I know the figure that's been sort of bandied around is perhaps 500% tariffs on countries that sort of buy petroleum and uranium.
Potentially. I mean, I'm not an economist, but what I would say is that if you look at the Russian economy, it's not doing particularly well. I think, I don't want to be one of these people that say, oh no, the Russian economy is going to collapse tomorrow. But you can look at statements by the Russians themselves, including the head of the Russian central bank, including Putin himself, where they've said inflation's very high, interest rates are very high. Putin actually said that he's going to reduce military spending next year because of inflation. So the Russian economy isn't doing fantastically well, and I do think that people always look at sanctions. They say, well, sanctions have either worked or not worked. But I think the correct way to view sanctions is they are part of the response to Russia. They aren't the entire response. So they're not perfect, but they're also not useless. They're part of this package of responses that definitely damages the Russian economy. So I think when you're looking at sanctions, you should look at how the Russian economy would be doing if there was no sanctions. But obviously, any increased level of sanctions is just going to increase the pain that the Russian economy feels right now.
I just want to ask about something else. There was some leaked audio that was made public this week of Trump claiming years ago that he warned Vladimir Putin that he would bomb the S out of Moscow if he invaded Ukraine. Now, obviously, we're not privy to that conversation. We don't know when that took place. I mean, do you think we ever actually would see US military action?
No, you're not going to see US military action against Russian units inside Russia, simply because both sides have nuclear weapons and you have the deterrence effect of those weapons. I think, could you ever see potentially US military action against Russian units inside Ukraine? Potentially. In fact, that was one of the options that the Biden administration, if my sources are correct, mooted in response to the Russians using a nuclear weapon in 2022. They potentially suggested that they would use conventional military power to target Russian assets inside Ukraine if the Russians use a nuclear weapon. And obviously, in that case, it's not conducting a strike directly on Russian territory. And we've also seen, if you look, go back to Syria, there were cases where the US Air Force engaged Russian forces on the ground about the Battle of Kasham, where Wagner forces were engaged by the US Air Force and absolutely annihilated. I think it's possible, but in Ukraine at least, but definitely not strikes against Russian targets inside Russia, because that would cross a line, an actual Russian red line that I don't think the US would want to cross, or I don't think should be crossed at this point.
Just finally, while this has all been going on, all this rhetoric that we've seen from Donald Trump, Russia has, of course, launched kind of devastating attacks on Kyiv 2 nights in a row, which have killed 2 people and injured 28 more. You're obviously there at the moment. In Ukraine at least, does it feel like right now peace is still very far away?
Oh, absolutely. Peace has never felt close, at least in my time here, and I've been here since May 2022, so over 3 years now. Peace has never seemed likely, not least because, again, Putin still thinks that he can gain more by fighting than by coming to the table and negotiating an end to this war. For the Ukrainians, they can't stop fighting, right? If they stop fighting, Ukraine ceases to exist. So, the Russians can always go home. It's as simple as that. But for the Ukrainians, they can't stop fighting. So they are really essentially hostage to fortune in this instance. That, they obviously, everyone here would want the war to end, but just and this is what people don't really understand. You see people say, "Oh well, the war ending is the most important thing." No, for Ukrainians, not being under Russian occupation is the most important thing, because Russian occupation is horrific. And any Ukrainian you speak to would rather fight and die than live under Russian occupation, at least in my experience. And I've spoken to people from the occupied territories that lived under Russian occupation. I've spoken to people in Kyiv. I've spoken to people pretty much in the entirety of Ukraine, because I've traveled pretty much everywhere in this country since I moved here. And that is what people just do not understand. War is not the worst thing that can happen to you. Living under Russian occupation, the torture, the rape, the mutilation, the arbitrary killing, that's far worse.
And if Donald Trump or anyone in his administration happened to be watching this, what would your message be for them from Ukraine?
My message would be, go back to the mantra of peace through strength. America has exceptional military, economic, and diplomatic power. Use it. Russia is right now essentially laughing at you. They think that you're a rube. They think they're playing you along, tapping you along, as Trump likes to say. They've never been negotiating with you in good faith. And to Trump specifically, if you do end this war in a way that is advantageous to the Ukrainian people, that the Ukrainian people feel is a good deal for them, they will be the first calling for you to get a Nobel Peace Prize. So if you really want that, end the war in a way that benefits Ukraine.
Jimmy Rushton, thank you so much for joining us on the Trump Report. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.